Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Wuthrich. He is Assistant Director in the Center for Global and International Studies, also a REES faculty member. He is a specialist in Middle East politics, and especially the politics of Turkey, where he spent many years studying and living and working. Last year he published a book called National Elections in Turkey, and a whole series of books devoted to modern intellectual and political history of the Middle East. So as you can imagine, when the coup happened midway through the summer, I didn't waste any time in walking down to Mike's office and asking him to give us the insider sort of scoop on the coup and the aftermath of the coup. I'm happy to say that he
Right, right. Thanks, Bart, and thanks to the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies for inviting me today. I don't think they planned on it, but it's a little bit of an irony that Turks would understand this, that I'm speaking about a failed military coup today in particular. It's a national holiday in Turkey called the Zafer Bayramı, which means victory holiday, and it's the day that everybody celebrates the military in Turkey. And so this is this is the day that I'm giving the talk. Somewhat fitting, but also kind of tragicomic. I'm probably going to. I like to talk. I tend to ramble on. So I've intentionally tried to pull my punches a little bit today to give enough time for questions, because I realize, I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, this is my particular area of expertise, or at least one of them, Turkish politics in general, but even my very first research that I ever got published, in fact, was on military coups and the media and in Turkey and interventions and failed and successful attempts. So I'm pretty familiar with this area, but I have to say, living through this and being an expert has been a bit unfortunate for me, because it's kind of painful to see what's going on in Turkey and think about a lot of people that I consider friends and family in Turkey and what they're going through, and with the anxiety about Turkey's direction in the future, it's a little bit heavy-hearted that a scholar usually likes to talk about stuff that they know about, but in this case it's a little challenge for me. Today, actually, I'm also going to take a little bit of a different tack than you're probably used to. You usually don't get a scholar coming up and telling you that that there's no answers to our questions, but I'm actually going to systematically prove to you why that's the case and why we're in a context now that the one thing I hope I do convince you of by the time I'm done with the talk is that you shouldn't believe anybody who's explaining the coup, like why it really happened, or what anybody. There are a lot of different narratives of what actually happened, and I want to kind of explain from my expertise why they're just talking and why we don't really know. So we do know there was a coup attempt. You probably have seen some of the images. So one of the exciting things or interesting things about the coup that we'll come back to is just the people's involvement in it. A lot of images of the position of military and civilians right during the night of the evening of the coup, and everybody's trying to figure out what's going on and who these people are, and then mass rallies both the night of the coup, and then afterwards. I think this is actually a rally that took place on the 16th, the night after the coup. But we saw all these sorts of things, and then we hear stories about, okay, what went on, why did it happen, and that's the complexity of this is what I want to talk about. So just so you have an idea of where I'm going, and I'm going to miss some gaps. I probably would have put 5 or 6 things, not 3 things, if I wanted to really talk about it fully. But I think these are the important ones to explain the confusion that exists in the international understanding of what happened in the coup. So we'll talk about the media impact on the coup and the Fethullah Gulen element in the coup. And then also probably thinking about my audience, there's also an important American component to the coup, whether we like it or not, in some sense. There's an overlap that is uncertain. Again, we don't know for sure. That's another thing we can't be certain of, but I'm going to explain why it's not just a conspiracy theory necessarily to link them together. So, and then I'll have some overall implications, and we'll hopefully have time for questions. So the first topic I want to talk about is the media. And this is actually, I want to start with a small aside, but it's very interesting to me. Social media, of course, has been factoring into a lot of national and international events, at this stage. But, one of the interesting things about the media or social media or developments in the media is that a lot of what the organization of the coup plotters took place on WhatsApp, right? So this is just a still shot photo that I took of a screenshot of a YouTube or a media video showing all of these. The WhatsApp title is the basic short name for the coup plotters' title for themselves. And then you see all of these different elements kind of writing in as they scroll through all the comments or the interaction on WhatsApp. The other, the other interesting thing, and maybe you saw this too, but the president actually talked to the people through a conventional media site with FaceTime. So he used a FaceTime app on a phone. He talked to a reporter. The reporter was holding a microphone up to her telephone, right? It's her smartphone that she had on air, and she'd ask the president questions and stick the microphone up there. And there was even some, off the side, there was even another one of the reporters was asking him questions as she was holding it up there, and he was talking. And so, some of the pictures are comical. Erdogan is getting older, but it reminded me of, talking to my parents on Skype, where he comes in and the headshot at first, he looks like Kilroy with his, head half cut. But he was able to effectively speak to the people of Turkey that way, and it was kind of interesting. So social media was all over the place in this event. But the other interesting, the really critical element of the media has to do with the nature of how the coup plotters interacted with the media while the coup was taking place. And they messed up, right? They did. They royally messed up. Like in a way that could be predictable that it failed. And I would actually argue, based on the way things were happening and some of the other elements, that might have been a good thing that it failed so quickly, because had the media had a major role in the failure, and had it not, Turkey might be in civil war right now potentially. So maybe it was okay if they were going to fail, that they failed big with the media's help on the night of the coup. But one of the arguments, so the very first paper I ever wrote was about military interventions and the use of the media and how that's changed over time, and how the military has needed, if it wanted to be successful in communicating to the people or kind of using media as a strong force, it actually changed its interaction scope with the media. So especially up to 1980, so this is just a still shot of the coup that took place on 1980. General Kenan Evren is speaking to the people on the state-run television, telling them, okay, this is a coup, this is why it happened, and everybody stay at home, right? So everybody stay at home, don't go out. And this was the nature of all the coups up to that point, whether failed or successful. So the media, to whatever extent that existed at the time of the coup, at one point it was really only radio, and later on it was television and radio. The military was using media as a walkie-talkie to the people primarily. And their message was, stay out of it, right? This is why we're doing it. Here is our interpretation. This is why we're entering in. Stay at home. We may come for you eventually, but stay there. And that was effective up to what we saw on July 15th. In all failed and successful coup attempts, and there were a number of notable failed coup attempts in the 1960s, had nothing to do with the people, right? Was completely at the top level, at the military and political elite level, that the coup was taking place, whether it failed or succeeded. So this July 15th was a huge break, right? It's unusual, I think, even in other countries, right? There's not very many cases where citizens rise up in the middle of a coup and stop it. I'm racking my brain to think of another clear example, but in Turkey, the very exact opposite had always occurred, right? So this is something really unusual. And what's interesting is on the night of the coup plotters, shortly after the coup started, went to the same state-run television station and had the reporter give the same kind of announcement, right? It had all the structure of all the old familiar coup announcements. This is why we're doing it. Here's a list of all the crimes of the government that require an intervention, and stay at home, right? So, that should work. No, except, of course, especially since 1990, Turkey has been inundated with commercial television stations, private television stations, private channels. You might have even seen it, but some of the Western media has trumped up the fact that 120 media outlets in Turkey were closed after the coup. That's actually such a small fraction. Like, if you knew how many media outlets there actually were, you'd realize that they're just talking about the few Gulen, Fethullah Gulen controlled media groups. They're not really talking about the ones that are the regular media outlets. So if you think about that, going from one, right, in the previous coups, they had just one state-run channel. They could use it as a walkie-talkie, right? Everything was good. They communicated to people to say, everything's okay, stay at home, right? This time they take over the one, and government had controlled that television station. And in fact, that might have been even part of why it backfired so badly. They were speaking to the exact wrong crowd. The only people watching TRT news at this point were like Erdogan's friends and families, right? Like, they're the last people to really buy into whatever's being said on that television station. All the rest of the relatively free, or at least private media, was wide open until really late. They made a last-ditch attempt late in the evening, too late in the game, to try to shut down CNN Turk, which was the lady that was doing the FaceTime, that she was the reporter for CNN Turk, and I think that's why they went there, to shut that one down. But they left everything else open, right? So the media is completely open while the events are taking place. And eventually, within not too long of time, there were reporters stationed at all these major military-civilian encounters. And so not only do people, like normally in a coup, if the military controls the media space, people don't know what's going on outside, they're definitely not going to go out. But when you see all these news images of people out, right, it kind of compels you emotionally, psychologically, potentially, to go out.
Take a drink.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, good advice. So, okay. So one of the interesting implications, there are a number of implications of this on the media. The fact that the media was open was not a small matter at all. And it led to a few consequences that are still affecting us in our understanding of even what happened today. One obvious thing is, if you think about in a country where there has been some media censorship, some closures, some actions against opposition sources to the government for the media. So if you're in the midst, if you're in the midst of a coup attempt and you don't know which way it's going to go, and you're the media, what are you going to do? You're going to hedge your bets, right? You don't know how this is going to turn out. Right? It would be really foolish for you to take a stridently anti-government stance, right? Because then what are you going to be labeled as? You're going to be implicated in the coup itself, right? So Timur Kuran, who's a economic scholar who's done some notable stuff on revolutions and these kinds of situations, refers to it as preference falsification. We don't know exactly what the people in the media were thinking, but they trended toward a pro-government or at least neutral stance of reporting. Okay, so everything was leaning, as the night passed, everything was leaning very positive. We've got to go out and save democracy, support the government or whatever. It really changed, the media changed heavily toward the government when it was uncertain, and then as they felt like the coup plotters might be losing. This is another interesting element that you see on social media. A lot of, maybe it was a coincidence, or you tell me what's happening here, but like for a lot of the people that were stridently antagonistic to President Erdogan, right, on the night of the coup had like social media sentences like this, that she's got Turkish first and then English, where she's like, somebody hacked into my account and said stuff, and I don't know who did it or why they did. I'm going to try to find out, doggone it. And that, and erase those things, and, again, the preference falsification, covering themselves. And then, for the 10, 15 days after that, everything's pro-democracy, right, to cover her situation. So you have this sort of preference falsification. The other thing that happened, which I think is really the death knell on us understanding what really happened. So ultimately, when the media is open, the people who reach out the most get to determine the story or narrative. And on the night of the coup, it was the government that won on getting their story out. Like the interpretation of everything that was happening, all the elements, everything that we know about the coup, as it was happening even, started to be informed to us by the government itself, right? Now that doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of everything they said was false, but we know that some of the things that they've said are clearly not true and self-supporting, self-interested statements that we know are probably false. So it's really hard to disentangle, what's going on or what really happened because of that consequence. So even the international press and their interpretation was completely beholden to that narrative. The only information that they could give people about what was happening in the coup was primarily coming from government sources. Okay? And that doesn't mean that this was all a big conspiracy, right? Or that the coup never happened or whatever. It just means that the government was able to spin it exactly the way that they wanted to spin it to, and the international media had to buy it and reproduce it. And so all of our interpretations, the mainstream interpretations of what happened that evening and who was involved in exactly what happened, is coming from the government side. So that makes it a challenge for us. They obviously have a self-interest. They haven't laid out anything that condemns them or in any way, of course, right? Well, is that ever possible, that anybody's ever without fault? So because of the dynamics of the media, we're kind of stuck on this. Okay? So one of the major narratives of the media, right, and this has come up, and this has been a big question mark, okay? The Fethullah Gulen angle is very complicated. And again, just like the media has created a situation that allows us not to know exactly what went on. I mean, the only person that really knows what went on the night of the coup, probably in its entirety, might be President Erdogan and maybe one or two other people close to him. And so unless you get an audience with him, and unless he's willing to tell you the truth, we're probably not going to know. But Fethullah Gulen was involved somehow. And not the person necessarily, but at least some of his supporters. And you have probably heard about the mass incarcerations, right? Removals from posts. I think something like 40,000 people were taken into custody. About half of them are still kept in custody. That includes bureaucrats, media people, obviously soldiers in that 20,000. And another 70,000 or so, they say, were removed from their jobs. And they weren't taken into custody, but they lost their jobs. So they're out of work. And the explanation, of course, for all of these, they're not just random people. It's not just the regular opposition or whatever. The argument is all of these people have some connection with Fethullah Gulen. How do we know if this is true or not? Well, that's part of the problem that Gulen has also created himself. Okay, but before we get there's a rivalry, a little bit of a personal battle between Fethullah Gulen and Erdogan, and it's, you know, some people might be surprised at this, but it was actually a little bit of a surprise when the Justice and Development Party, Erdogan's party, rose to power. It was a bit of a surprise that the Gulen supporters of Gulen actually bought into that party initially, because historically, the Erdogan comes from traditions of a Naqshbandi-rooted Sunni Sufi sect, right, and whose ideology isn't completely different from like the Said Nursi and Fethullah Gulen sects. They're not completely different in like their interpretation of, you know, Quranic scripture or whatever, but politically within Turkey, they've had trouble working together. So there was a period of time where they were working together, particularly between 2002 and 2011. You started seeing the seams cracking between their relationship already at that time. One of the very first really public kind of strange breaks between the two was when there was a ship that was going to Israel that was with a Turkish humanitarian group, and it was boarded by Israeli commandos, and there was the commandos shot some of the people on the boat. And so Erdogan took that on as his pet champion project. He, you know, like this was his big thing that he was going to kind of take a stand behind. And like right when he was doing that, Fethullah Gulen very publicly made a statement that criticized what that group had done and that they were in the wrong and that they shouldn't, you know, and that was, people were surprised at that time, where's this coming from? And then during Gezi Park, the Gezi Park protests where the social, a lot of civil society got out and protested in Istanbul and then other places in Turkey against Erdogan and the government. During that time, again, Fethullah Gulen takes a hard critical stance against Erdogan. And then shortly after that, Erdogan and his government starts going after Fethullah Gulen's prep schools in Turkey. And then, and it's a reasonably good guess, I would say. Most people would say, although we don't have 100% proof, most people could say, we can reasonably say that the corruption indictments against people close to Erdogan at the end of 2013 were instigated by supporters, sympathizers of Gulen, and then the police leaked encrypted phone messages that only special police could have access to that showed him talking about where to stash the cash, with his son or whatever. So that was probably, realistically, I think it was those were probably Gulen supporters too. Now the question is always, because they were Gulen supporters, does that mean Gulen had anything to do with it, or were they just doing things that they thought would be in his benefit? To go after this guy that's going after him, like his supporters, are they just taking matters into their own hands? And then at that point, Erdogan declares war on Gulen, calls them the parallel state, and he begins to shuffle people around, shuffle bureaucrats around that he knows are Gulen sympathizers, so that they have less influence or control. But of course, where did all of these people, this is another thing that's important to remember, and some people have been talking about this, but it's got to be clear. In the military, whether they're Gulen supporters or not is a little bit trickier to understand because the military was actively weeding out Gulen supporters. So of course, if anybody who liked Gulen who was in the military was super quiet about it and may have pretended not to be affiliated with him at any, but in the bureaucracy, that was not the case. Gulen supporters were usually very open about the fact that they were Gulen supporters, and Erdogan and the AKP party had been putting them into all those positions. So all the people that he removed from power, he put into power about a decade ago, right? So that's an important area that they didn't get in there secretly. It wasn't some big conspiracy, right? A lot of the Gulen has strongly supported education, modernity, science, whatever, and all of those things. So, and a lot of their outreach actually happens at the university level among students. So they tend to be a very highly educated group. So when you have open positions in the bureaucrats and you want religious conservatives to go in, they're a particularly fruitful group to draw from initially when everything was going well. Okay, but then he got stuck and realized one of the reasons why they had the list ready to go is because they wrote they were all out in the open and everybody knew who they were, but are they guilty of something? Were these people out during the coup? Were they plotting? Were they even aware of what was going on in the military? That's a completely different question. And the reason is that the very structure of the people that are affiliated with Gulen, like the structure has been made very intentionally to be fluid and loose and not complete. The connections are not supposed to be transparent or obvious. That doesn't mean evil necessarily. We just don't know. Okay, what's the intentions of the fluidity? And some of it is because, like if you're taking a devil's advocacy approach for Gulen, you would say, look, they didn't have much of a choice because people were constantly actually antagonistic to them, from the very beginning. So it was a structure that allowed them to be able to continue as a group. But you have, a lot of the people, right, the 70,000 people, if they're even associated with Gulen at all, nobody knows. This is part of the conspiracy theory narrative, right, about Gulen, is that you never know who supports Gulen because of this, they use the word takie, right? That they're, in the conspiracy theory, that Gulen supporters intentionally pretend to be just normal folk who are closet, servants of, this charismatic individual. And so that fits in perfectly. When people are rounded up, you're like, gosh, man, I didn't know. Well, they really fooled me. But did they, right? Is the joke on us or, are they? So there's one question mark there, but then even the nature of the structure, to whatever structure there is it like there tends to be people who like Gulen tend to be connected in little groups, right? Neighborhood groups, like you have a community like Quran study, they're called sobets, or they not Quran studies necessarily, but studies of like Gulen commentary, religious commentary. They'll sit down, or they'll they'll read Said Nursi, like the Risale Nur, and they'll meet and they'll have this kind of connected web. They also provide cheap to free housing for some university students who live in what are called ushikevi, like light houses or like dorms, with a whole bunch of guys that pray together and do things together or whatever, and they meet and they share things and food or whatever, and they're nice group, but they're operating at this level, and there tends to be a hierarchy, and so for that little group they have what's called an abi or a big brother, who then is connected to abis above them, who are connected to abis above them, and then eventually some of them, and occasionally even, in the network it doesn't. There's this hierarchy, but then there's also this ability where somebody, if he can get a plane ticket and come to Pennsylvania, can actually go and meet Fethullah Gulen face to face, and then they feel like, oh, the distance has been gapped and whatever. But for the most part, there's kind of a hierarchy, and you can't say that people at this level there's no certainty that they know anything that's going on here. Again, not necessarily that it's bad or good or whatever, but that's the structure is not, it's fluid and not super transparent. And because of this, right, there's a whole embedded system of like plausible deniability. So Joshua Hendricks, who's done some interesting recent scholarship on the Gulen movement, says the ability to plausibly deny the central role of Gulen's leadership in the mobilization of the Gulen movement overall, to deny institutional connectivity, social network connectivity, financial overlaps, economic opportunism, and politically motivated self-promotion have been crucial to the Gulen movement's uninterrupted growth for 3 decades, right? So the fact that it's kind of linked and autonomous, everything's linked and autonomous at the same time. So when Fethullah Gulen, this is actually a transcript that you can get on his website. When he came to the US initially, right, they had to decide whether they were going to allow him to live here because there was an indictment against him in Turkey. So he had to meet with immigration services, and there was a long testimony that he gave. And I mean, he puts the testimony, the transcript of the testimony on his own website. But it's interesting, it's telling based on what I'm saying here. So they're asking him a question. The immigration services person says, okay, do you belong to an organization? He says, I have never been a member of any organization. Do you lead an organization? I have nothing to do with any organization and had nothing to do with its direction or leadership. Has there been any organization that was formed on your behalf that you know of? And he says, I have no relationship with any such organization and do not know any such organization. And a few questions later, they say, has anybody on your behalf established schools in Turkey and elsewhere? And if you know anything about Gulen, you know about his schools, right? He says, not on my behalf, not on my behalf. But with promotion or encouragement, maybe they have, because they know I like education, and where they've opened schools, I don't know. Do you have any role in the teaching in those schools? Absolutely not. I have nothing to do with it. That actually might be true. Are you responsible for what's taught in those schools? No, not me. The government is responsible, meaning the government's where the schools are. It's happening under the supervision of the government. So they have this ability to technically not link anything to him, ever. So even the question of schools, what's interesting about this is a few years later, when he applied to get his residency permit, he used the argument that he was a teacher of all of this great education as the reason why we should keep him in the US. So in one transcript, he has no connection, doesn't even know where the schools are or what they teach. But that some people might have started schools because they knew he liked education. That was his argument. To later, he was actually allowed to be a resident, get a green card or whatever in the US because he was a leader, a teacher of exceptional qualities, right? And because of this network and everything else. So this plausible deniability, this ambiguity, creates a problem, right? But that also means that there's a good chance, I mean, there have been other, it's not likely, right? he's such a charismatic figure, it's not likely, even if he wanted a coup to take place in Turkey, that he would have ever literally said the words. He wouldn't have needed to. He wouldn't have needed to. He could have made some sort of kind of general comment about the bad state of Turkey and wished that something could happen. And that's all that he would need to say. And of course, most people in Turkey have said those exact words, I don't know how many times, right? You couldn't convict anybody of that. But the people under him act on his behalf, right? So he's able to separate himself, right, from this group. But certainly, down the chain, whatever this group is doing, right, he has a way of not implicating himself. But the problem here is that it didn't matter in this case, right? Whether there was a group of people associated with Gulen who were involved in the plot of this coup, it's had a huge implication for every single one who's had any sort of interest in this guy or his ideas. They're all being rounded up, right? They're all being, and we have no idea of knowing. And based on the organizational structure and just like knowing a lot of these people, especially at the the far out level, like they were certainly not, they wouldn't have even been, there are too many of them to even, realistically, they were not commandos waiting to act for some sort of coup takeover. They probably had no idea. And they're probably indignant about the fact that he's even accused because they'd never heard anything like that and would be kind of angered that they're being implicated in all of this, right? So there's a reason why they can even deny, but that doesn't, I'm absolutely certain that there was a cell in the military that was chiefly responsible for this coup plot, that at least a lot of them, not all of them, were sympathizers of this man, and probably partly acting for their own interest and partly acting for his interests. But this is also why the extradition question becomes a tricky one, right? I'm absolutely sure whether he knew of it, whether he was kind of inspired the action to take place or not, there will never ever be a shred of like court-worthy evidence that he's connected. That's not the way that they would work anyway. So it creates an awkward situation between America and Turkey, which I will get back to. But there's no there's no way of knowing, right? Except for maybe a few top people in the Gulen leadership structure. They would have a better idea of like how many people knew or whatever. But it's really hard to say. And we're inundated every day with kind of what has become mainstream conspiracy theories becoming mainstream simply because something happened that kind of broadly fit the conspiracy theory. Now there are a lot of people that have adopted that conspiracy theory whole hog and assume that it's all they're all connected together. And okay, maybe that's the thing, we don't know, right? So maybe, but that's why nobody can say with certainty. The last issue for the American involvement in anti-Americanism in Turkey, like this is so pro-government newspaper, and this wasn't the only one, like the kind of the American flag in the background and Fethullah Gulen. This is not intended to say, hey, he's a good guy, in America. This is saying, dun dun dun, we told you so, right? He's a CIA operative, right? The conspiracy theory narrative is that he's a CIA operative working for American interests in Turkey, so that they're using him and his supporters to get American interests done within the country. Now, I think that's mostly ridiculous, but there are some reasons. Here's the thing. Never have Turks had more grounds to argue, real grounds to argue, that there was some connection that we can't completely explain. And, something I'm a little embarrassed about. But there's the Gulen issue, and this is another, and it could all be a coincidence, but this is open record, so we know all the letters to even get him to stay as a resident in Turkey, and everybody in Turkey knows this, right? We're from high-profile former CIA folks, and U.S. ambassador, so State Department people, whatever. So it's hard to explain, okay, how was this a coincidence? Like, how many people who are applying for residency in the U.S. get letters from the CIA to say, this guy's cool, let him stay here, right? And of course, in the Turkish media, Turkish public, everybody also knows about the 85 boxes of evidence that Turkey delivered to the U.S. State Department or whatever for the extradition, right? My first inclination when I heard there were 85 boxes was that there'd only be 85 boxes if there's nothing in them, right? Nothing of any usefulness. So you would only need one box or like one folder or 10 pages, right, if there was good evidence against him, if you think about it from a rational standpoint. So there's this issue, but at the same time, in the Turkish public mindset, whether people support Erdogan or not, they're seeing this and saying, what's America doing? I don't understand. This guy's bad. We all know he's guilty, right? And so this is also one of those interesting elements where the Erdogan supporters and their most virulent opposition are totally like high-fiving on the same page, best buddies in their dislike of Gulen. So everybody's buying into whatever the government is saying about Gulen in Turkey, and so all of these people, you have all spectrums of Turkish society really wondering what's going on with America. Now the other thing, and this is maybe even a little bit more embarrassing and harder to explain, right, is that one of the major bases involved in the coup attempt was the Incirlik Air Force Base, where American soldiers and NATO soldiers are housed with the Turkish army. And of course, they were, the Turkish commander of that base was involved in the plot and was taken into custody. But I also happen to know from kind of bizarre chance inside information that I think is reliable because there wasn't any reason for that information to be told to me differently, is that at least some of the officers, American officers, knew 2 weeks in advance that the coup was coming. And this is a NATO ally, right, NATO government, and it doesn't seem like anybody said anything, right? That doesn't mean that if I were a betting man, and again, I'm not 100% sure, it could be that those American officers just decided not to tell their superiors or move it up the chain. That seems like what military people usually do, right? No. But let's say that happened, right? They probably knew. I doubt that the U.S. wasn't providing any support or logistics or anything for the plot itself. But if I were a betting man, it seems like we might have been caught knowing and not saying, which is really awkward for an ally, right? For someone that's an ally. But if you think about Erdogan, right, that it's possible, like he's not popular with us or most international people or a lot of people in Turkey. So there might have been this feeling, let's let this thing play out and see what happens. Okay. So, but because of this is important for us. The NATO U.S. base is on the table. There's a question mark of whether that, like, unless we get this sorted out with Turkey, there's a question of whether we're going to be able to keep this base. And it's been, fairly important for whatever involvement we have in Syria with ISIS or whatever. And of course, we have nuclear weapons there. And so it's not super easy to move those nuclear weapons. And so that's going to be a big issue if Turkey and the U.S. can't get this resolved. It's because of all of these connections that are widely known and common knowledge in Turkish public opinion in the public sphere, right? Anti-Americanism in Turkey, like they sold us out, like they were going to let the soldiers overrun the country or whatever. That's anti-Americanism has gone up quite a lot, at least as much as it was during the Iraq War. The other issue is that, whether we extradite him or not, like this is going to be a thorn in the U.S. side with Turkey. So that's going to be ongoing. The other, I'm on the last slide here, and then we'll open up to questions. Everything has been set for the regime, whatever it is, like competitive authoritarianism or really bad illiberal democracy or whatever it is. It's been set up to go down a path that would be even worse than whatever it is right now. That's really troubling, and that's one of the reasons why Erdogan even said after the coup this was a gift of God, from God. Why did he say that? Well, he's got all the playing cards right now. If he wants to use them, right, he's got largely a blank check. I also think the fact that he said it was a gift of God, if you think about it logically, is proof that there wasn't this conspiracy that he created a fake coup against himself, because then you're immediately subjecting yourself to that speculation if you didn't, So I think he's like, they did this and they did me a favor. That's probably the best way to take that. So weirdly enough, this has brought together all the government and the Turkish opposition parties. There was a lot of polarization in Turkey, so in some sense you could see that as positive, but also could be seen as something we like to call co-optation. So that the opposition parties just now, the government, is there no real opposition to the government at this point? Both are plausible interpretations of the same thing. But one positive, right, at least post-coup, government really has tamped down its rhetoric and acted somewhat positively toward opposition parties. Well, the opposition parties are being nice to them too, but even some of the promises or changes would be welcome that they're suggesting, but proof is in the pudding, right? We haven't seen any changes yet, and it could just be talk that we forget, and then, they move back to this issue. But not everything has been absolutely bad. But one thing, again, to go back to one of the implications of all of this, is that Erdogan was kind of notorious, right? So he'd been in the press. So after the coup, everybody's focusing on what Erdogan is doing. The Turks kind of feel left out of that discussion, right? The Turkish society went through this major trauma. We know that well over 200 people died. Okay, so similar to the Paris attacks or even Charlie Hebdo or whatever, people from around the world marched with the French people or whatever in solidarity, but Turkey's quote-unquote friends didn't do that for them. They just immediately started critiquing what was happening in the days after the coup. And from the Turkish standpoint, they feel a little bit betrayed. They also think, we did something cool. How many coups have been stopped because people stood in front of tanks? And some people actually got ran over by tanks. Some people dived underneath tanks and then dived under the next tank. I mean, you can see the videos of these things. And they're kind of isn't anybody going to praise us for our spirit or, doing something extraordinary like this? And all of that's kind of been lost in the discussion. So I think I've met my point. So questions now, yes?